Okay. Hi guys, let's get started. Alright, let's just look quickly at the syllabus, where we are, where we're going. So we're doing the second part of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, tonight, and then on Thursday we're doing 3 essays, 2 essays by Immanuel Kant and 1 by Benjamin Constant. So the Kant essays are The Idea for Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View and What is Enlightenment, and then Benjamin Constant's essay is The Liberty of the Ancients Compared with That of the Moderns. Now I'll show you guys where these are located. There's a PDF for the Constant essay, and for the 2 Kant essays, there's a HTML file. There's also, I think, a link in the info text file. Let me see if that's the case. Yes, there is a web link. I don't know if that's active anymore. So those are our readings for Thursday. Next week, to go back to the syllabus, we'll be rounding out our discussion of basically the bourgeois philosophers, or the philosophers of bourgeois emancipation, of the bourgeois revolution, with Hegel. So Monday, the introduction to the philosophy of history, which is, again, pace yourselves, it's about 100 pages. Or 90-something pages. And then we will get into Marx starting next week on Tuesday and Thursday. So we'll read some early Marx and selections from the 1844 manuscripts for Tuesday of next week, and then on Thursday we'll read some other short selections from Marx as well as the Communist Manifesto. Alright, so for our second discussion of Smith, I actually wanted to introduce something that we could have discussed last night, but I wanted to give ourselves a little bit more time to discuss the reading and to discuss the notes that you guys posted on the reading. But tonight I'd like to start off just with a way of kind of summarizing some of the discussion of Smith so far, as well as setting the stage for Marx later on. And we'll cover this again when we do the 1844 manuscripts, but I wanted to just sort of introduce the concept tonight, and that is the commodity form. So, use value and exchange value. So there's a chart of terms on Canvas. I'll send a link to it later via an announcement on Canvas. But let's look at this together just a little bit. Because Smith introduces the discussion of commodity, the commodity form of value. So again, this chart would be good for Smith. It's also good for Marx when we get into Marx next week. So we're talking about a couple of different things here. We're talking about a way of valuing the product of labor as a commodity, but we're also talking about the value of labor itself as a commodity. So for something, for a good, to be a commodity, it has to be two different things at the same time. It has to have two forms of value at the same time. So the commodity form of value is a combination of two different values: use value and exchange value. So something is valuable because it's useful, and it's valuable because it's exchangeable. The use of something, the use of anything, the use of any good, is concrete and particular in character, meaning it's embedded in a context. It happens at a certain moment in space and time. Anyone's use of anything is, in this respect, because it is concrete and particular and of a qualitative character, anyone's use of anything is incommensurable with anyone else's use of anything else. So use values are qualitative, concrete, and particular, and because of that, they're incommensurable. So a commodity is something that's useful. Something that's not useful cannot be a commodity. It has to be useful. The other side of the form of value in the commodity is its exchange value. So for something to be a commodity, it has to be useful. It also has to be exchangeable. By definition, a commodity is only a commodity if it's exchangeable. As something that's exchangeable, or something that has exchange value, has value in exchange, by definition it has to be commensurable, because exchange value is a way of making things commensurate in value. So it has to be capable of being, for instance, quantified, compared, quantified in that respect, abstracted from its concrete context. When something is exchanged, it has its exchange value is more abstract in character than its use value. And by making things commensurable, for instance by quantification, that's not the only way, but making things commensurable gives that value a more general and even universal character. So in the commodity form, as a value, are combined use value and exchange value, which means combining the particular and the general, or the particular and the universal, means combining the concrete and the abstract, and combining the qualitative and the quantitative, unifying the qualitative and the quantitative, unifying the concrete and the abstract, unifying the particular and the general or universal. And this is why it's such a powerful form. And what we're going to see is the way Marx discusses this, but also the way Smith is discussing it, and the way Rousseau talked about it, is that this is a social relation. In other words, it's a societal relation, and it's a relation, as we'll see, that constitutes society. Now, why is that? It's because it's not just about goods, it's not just about things, it's not just about articles of consumption. It's also about how we produce those articles of consumption in society, how that production is socially mediated, and what motivates that production. So how and why we produce things as we do. And therefore, it's not just about the goods or articles of consumption that are produced, but it's about their production, meaning the labor that produces them. Labor as human activity in society, or we could say human activity as valued in society. So it'd be a little bit different from work. Actually, Engels has a point that he makes. He says it's useful that in English there are two different words, work and labor, whereas in German there's just one word. And the reason that that's useful is that work is any kind of transforming or transformative activity, whereas labor is really how it is valued in society. And one would also have to distinguish between activity, that is work and therefore valued as labor, and just any activity, like sort of organic activity, life processes. Although we'll see it also redounds onto that. So, how human activity is valued in society is a function of how labor is valued. And not only the goods that are produced, the articles of consumption, what Smith called the necessaries and conveniences of life, but labor itself has a useful aspect and it has an exchangeable aspect, meaning labor can only be a commodity if it's useful to someone in some way, and if it's exchangeable, if it has a value in exchange. So, Smith is talking about artisanal labor, where artisans produce entire products. What we're going to be exploring in more detail with Marx, but is already there in Smith, is wage labor. And meaning that one is not being paid for just the good that one produces, but for the time that one puts into producing that good, that article of consumption. So labor time, I mentioned that for Smith, labor time isn't simply what is the value of labor in production, the price, the natural as opposed to market price of goods. It isn't simply the case, but it should be the case. In other words, for Smith, in order for society to maximize its productive potential, labor should be compensated in time rather than through piecework. So he's advocating for wage labor. Okay, let's go back to the question of social relations. We'll come back to this when we do Marx. So we'll explain it more deeply when we get into it with Marx. But let's pause a moment on the issue of social relations. So social relations, this box was also on the timeline, the Capitalism in History timeline, the long, like tens of thousands of years timeline of human history. This box is also present there. Social relations isn't merely a matter of relations between people. So it is a relation to others, social relation, but it's also a relation to nature, and it's a relation to oneself. It's a self-relation. So when we're talking about bourgeois social relations, we're talking about relating to others, relating to nature, and relating to ourselves through our labor, and through our labor as a commodity, namely through our labor as something useful and as something exchangeable. Time is money. But what kind of time is money? Labor time is money. Okay, now, social relations is a broader category than just bourgeois social relations. Bourgeois social relations of the commodity form of value, of labor. Before bourgeois society, traditional civilization, organized according to religion, how would one relate to others? Through a religious cosmology, through a practical moral system of how to relate to other divine creations. In traditional civilization, it's through a divine order in a great chain of being, as they referred to it in Christian theology in the Middle Ages. So, if there's a caste system, there's a priestly caste, warrior caste, there are commoners, there are farmers, there are artisans, there are merchants in the third estate, in the commoner caste. Then the way people relate to each other within and across castes is religious in character, because God has created the universe in this divine order in the great chain of being. Also, how one related to oneself was, again, through a religious relation. I think that I might have mentioned when we looked at that longue durée history that we're talking here about a cosmology, meaning it is about everything in the universe. So in a religious set of social relations, those social relations are cosmological in character. They relate to everything that exists. Similarly, in bourgeois social relations, everything, all of nature, all people, all aspects of ourselves are related to according to the specific social relations that are mediating and constituting society. So everything, the entire physical universe, the entire universe of organic life, of nature, becomes something that is an object of labor, a resource for labor, as our essential activity. I think that I mentioned also with the Protestant Reformation, Christianity is revolutionized, the traditional Christianity is overthrown, and a new principle, a new religious cosmology is developed that we refer to as the Protestant work ethic, meaning labor is the basis of our relation to God, to all of creation, to ourselves, to nature, and to the Creator, to God. Now, what we're going to get into with capitalism is that the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, is a crisis of these social relations, meaning these social relations, our relation to others, our relation to nature, and our relation to ourselves are in crisis. Because labor, valued as a commodity, comes into self-contradiction and crisis in industrial production in capitalism. We're not there yet. So let's talk about other aspects of bourgeois society that we're familiar with that are new and different in history. So the distinction between use value and exchange value in terms of the social relations of labor valued as a commodity, we get other kinds of distinction. We get other antinomies or dichotomies. Other dichotomies that can become antinomies, meaning that they are antinomical. They are ruled by contrary laws. That's what nomos means. Private versus public. In the caste system, there wasn't a private-public distinction, meaning an aristocrat is an aristocrat. It's not that they're simply aristocrats in public, but privately they're something else. No. And in that way, there's no distinction between the person and the role that they play in society. It's inherent in their being. It's as they were divinely created to be in the caste system. Form and content were unified in traditional civilization. There was a conventional, traditional, customary form for expressing a certain content. Means and ends were connected. There was a traditional way of doing things. And if you changed the means, you also changed the ends. in practice. And again, this can be traced back to the commodity form, meaning it looks like exchange value is like the public value of something, the use value is its private value. The person as a wage laborer, that's a role that they play because they can change jobs. It's not like the medieval guild system where you were permanently a member of a guild for life. You can change jobs. You can change the role that you play in society. It's no longer governed by a caste system, a divine order of a great chain of being. And so the person and the role can be distinguished. Now, these are also relations. They're not only distinctions, but they're relations. So the commodity form of value relates use value and exchange value. It relates the qualitative and the quantitative. It doesn't only combine and unify them, but it relates them. It relates the concrete and the abstract. It relates the particular and the general. Similarly, social relations relate the individual and the collective. So society has always been composed of individual people, individual human beings, but more importantly, individual persons. And yet, the way the individual and the collective were related changed. So the way the individual was related to the collective in a religious cosmology is different than in a labor cosmology according to the value of labor as a commodity. Also, content and form. Is use value the content and exchange value merely the form of value? But these kinds of questions are raised. Also, means and ends. Are people producing things to be useful, or are they producing them just for their exchange value? Well, of course, they're doing both. But which is the means and which is the ends? Just as there's the question of what is the form and what is the content. Maybe the actual content of commodity production is exchange value, and use value is the mere form of it. That's why in business school, at least they used to talk about producing widgets. Meaning it doesn't matter what you're producing, what matters is how you're producing it. You could be producing anything. You could be producing physical goods. You could be producing services. You could be producing intellectual goods, information, widgets. What matters is how you're producing it in business school, how a business is organized, how it achieves that productive activity. Because you could be producing anything, then you could just say, well, the real content of that production is to sell it, to realize its exchange value, and what in particular, concretely, you're producing as a use value is just the form of that exchange value. So form and content can flip sides in the same way that means and ends can flip sides. Maybe we're producing something useful just as a means towards the ends of realizing its exchange value. Or maybe we're trying to make something have exchange value as a means to realizing it as a use value. These are kind of reversible aspects of things. Okay, so just keeping that in mind. Because again, we're going to get a lot of discussion of this with Marx, but this conception of the commodity form of value predates Marx. It's from Bourgeois Political Economy, and it's already, it's being discussed before Adam Smith, but Adam Smith also engages in this discussion of use and exchange. Some things value in use and some things value in exchange. Okay, so we're switching gears today. We're having now a discussion of really what are kind of concrete cases. So if Adam Smith laid out a logical account of wealth and its production in society. And he also laid out a historical account of how this came to be the case, how this was realized in history. Then in tonight's reading, we're going to have a discussion of some examples of the kinds of issues and problems that have, or questions that have been raised that have manifested in the modern bourgeois era. So his discussion of colonies is about how bourgeois colonization is different from ancient or traditional civilizational expansion and colonization. But it's not wholly different, it's not de novo, it doesn't come out of nowhere, it comes out of this history, so it has precedence. And in certain respects, he's discussing colonization as it actually happened and as it is happening, but also he's talking about it in terms of how it should happen, how it should be the case, including how it should be understood, how its real character should be understood. So in some ways, colonization in the bourgeois era, after the Renaissance, has proceeded according to a self-understanding that was ancient and traditional in origin. But in that way, it mistook its own content. In other words, it was misunderstood. Its actual nature and character was misunderstood. But again, by the 1700s, we talked about this last night, bourgeois society is starting to be understood in its own terms, rather than by reference to classical antiquity or being understood in terms of Christianity. Okay, so colonization. Again, he has a kind of a logical account of it and a historical account of it. He's got precedents for it. And the precedents are from classical antiquity because medieval Europe didn't really colonize, didn't really expand. So if bourgeois society, if European civilization in the bourgeois epoch is engaged in a massive expansion and wave of colonization, as it was, from the 1500s, the 16th century, up through the 1700s, the 18th century, then it recalled earlier times in which this took place. So in the ancient Mediterranean world, there were two different patterns of colonization that took place. There was the Greek model and the Roman model. The Greek model is kind of unique. The Roman model is more typical, whether in terms of the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire. It's more typical of the history of civilization writ large. So civilizations throughout the world, in Europe, in North and South America, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, in the ancient Mesopotamian world, all followed a very similar pattern, and in certain respects, the Greek pattern was an outlier, was different, was unique. This is important to bear in mind. So mostly, civilizations expanded and colonized on the basis of conquest. And they did so in order to acquire and extract more resources. It conquered people as a resource. It conquered land as a resource. It extracted tribute as a resource. So this would be true of all the ancient empires, of all the ancient civilizations. Rome, even though it comes after Greece, is more according to that pattern. Now I mentioned Carthage. Carthage, like Athens, not just ancient Greece in general, but Athens in particular, has a more commercial character than the Roman Republic and Roman Empire did. Although the Roman Republic and Roman Empire also had a commercial character, so commerce is not unknown to the ancient world, but it's subordinate. It's subordinate to the logic of conquest. However, in the case of ancient Athens and ancient Carthage, and this is something that we'll talk about on Thursday when we read Benjamin Constant, it leans more in the direction of commerce than conquest. So the Greek model of colonization similarly follows a different pattern, and in some ways Carthage also. So colonization happens as a function of prosperity in the mother city, in the mother country, but really the mother city. And so the mother city, the metropole, that's what metropole means, it means mother city, the metropolitan city, the mother city, spawns offspring. So as the population grows, then people leave and establish new communities elsewhere. And they usually go to establish new communities in areas not already inhabited. And that's because they're just expanding the civilization. They're not conquering other people. They're not looking for a tributary relationship with the mother city, but rather relate back to the mother city through trade. Again, Carthage had some similar pattern to it. But ancient Greece, ancient Athens is the example that Adam Smith uses. Rome, again, the more typical model is conquest and tribute. Conquest to acquire resources including people, to conquer and enslave people and force them to produce tribute to support the mother country. In the Greek case, that's not what's happening. In other words, in the Greek case, the colonies are independent. There's not a tributary relationship. And they relate back to the mother city by trade. In other words, voluntarily, not as a function of force, conquest, military control. All right, so in the bourgeois epoch, beginning in the Renaissance, there begins a wave of bourgeois colonization. However, that bourgeois colonization is confused as to its motives. It has many motives. One motive, of course, is Christianity. Although, again, in the Middle Ages, in high Christendom, this wasn't the case. Christianity was not seeking to conquer new converts. No. Christopher Columbus, when he crossed the Atlantic Ocean and discovered the Western Hemisphere, the continents in the New World, even though he didn't know they were there, he was on his way to India and China for trade over the ocean as opposed to over the land, over the Silk Road, instead over the ocean. So he was in search of a trade route, but he found new territory, which he claimed for conquest, for extraction of resources, but also it was claimed, if not by Columbus, then by his patrons, the Spanish monarchy, in the name of Christianity and spreading Christianity. So it was a bourgeois mission that Columbus set sail on. He was in search of a trade route with another established civilization. Instead, he found nomadic hunter-gatherers in the Caribbean islands who he ended up conquering. So there's a mixture of a kind of Greek model and a Roman model at work there. Now, the major European powers that engage in colonization, they all have this mixed character. Some leaning more in one direction towards the Roman model, others leaning more in the direction of the Greek model. So there's Spain, there's Portugal, there's the Dutch, the French, the English. These are the colonizing countries of Western Europe, and they all handle things a little bit differently. They all set out in search of trade, Portugal and Spain, but also the Dutch, and the French and the British. They're in search of trade routes. They're establishing trade routes with the other major established civilizations in Asia. But they're also trading more locally in the Middle East and Africa. But then they really discover and end up colonizing the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Spanish, in particular, give us the conquistadors. So Columbus was not a conquistador. He's a Renaissance man, bourgeois explorer. He's on a voyage of discovery. He's seeking trade routes. He's followed up on by the conquistadors. So what do the conquistadors do? They find the dominant civilizations in the Western Hemisphere, at the time the Aztecs and the Incas, and they target them for conquest. So they go straight to the heart of the dominant civilizations to conquer them and establish a tributary relationship back to Spain with them. Again, though, under the auspices of conversion to Christianity, but really to extract gold and silver, in a way that Columbus was not able to realize. So that's the Spanish. The Portuguese engage in some of that, although they're less present in the Western Hemisphere than they are in the trade routes of the East Africa and Asia. The Dutch are also more like the Portuguese, exploring Africa, Asia, trade routes. But they engage in some settlement in North America. So the Dutch and the English, they settle in northern North America. So they're not conquering major civilizations and establishing tributary relationships. They're establishing trading outposts and settlements in relatively less populated regions among quote-unquote uncivilized people, meaning who are the people that the Dutch and the English are encountering in northern North America? They're encountering hunter-gatherer communities. They're not encountering settled agricultural communities. They're not encountering these major civilizations like the Aztecs and the Incas. And at first they try to coexist. They try to establish independent settlements and simply coexist with the Native Americans. Conflict comes later. The French similarly are establishing trade relations with the Native Americans and establishing trade outposts and settlements. The French are kind of in between the Spanish-Portuguese model and the English and Dutch model. So again, the English and the Dutch are more on the Greek model, the Spanish and Portuguese are more on the Roman model, and the French are somewhere in between. A mixture of those models. Because the French and the English and the Dutch, as well as the Spanish and the Portuguese, also established plantations. Not so much in the North American settlements, but in the Caribbean and in South America and Central America. So they established plantation colonies that are about producing for sending back to the metropolitan home country. And that, of course, is facilitated by the transatlantic African slave trade. So they try to enslave the Native Americans. And they do among the Aztecs and the Incas in terms of putting them to work in gold and silver mines in a very horrific way. But they also try to exploit as plantation labor indigenous peoples as slaves, but in fact, they're more vulnerable, the hunter-gatherer communities of the Caribbean and in North America are more vulnerable to the diseases of the Western Hemisphere that they don't have any immunity to. This also affects the Aztec and the Incas, but it affects the hunter-gatherer communities even more. And so it turns out that there's actually a lack of indigenous labor to be put to work in the plantations. And so the Europeans plug into an existing African slave trade that is done by the Arab and Muslim world, but then ramp it up to a great degree in order to send slaves to the New World, to work the plantations in the New World. And Smith discusses this. He discusses this. And again, it's according to the model of plantation slavery in the Roman era, and also seen in other classical civilizations of antiquity. The latifundia system, which the Portuguese and the Spanish have in Central and South America, is very similar to the Roman model in that aristocrats are given plantations as reward for conquest. So it's very much like the centurions and knights of the Roman Republic and Empire, and how they are rewarded for their conquest via being given plantations and slaves to work the plantations in order to extract tribute to send back to the metropole. So all of that is according to the ancient pattern and the pattern of traditional civilization throughout the world. What's new and different is this bourgeois pattern of colonization. And again, that's seen more following a Greek model and pursued by, above all, the English, but also to a certain extent by the Dutch, and to some extent also by the French. So the more bourgeois countries have a more bourgeois model of colonization, and the less bourgeois countries in Europe, the more traditional countries of Europe, have a more Roman model of colonization. Now, one of the things that he's accounting for is how the northern North American colonies, the English colonies in North America, especially the northern colonies, so not the slave plantation colonies of the southern North American colonies by the English, but the northern colonies, are actually wealthier, they have a higher standard of living, and are more productive than England is. So they've already surpassed the home country in terms of productivity of labor and wealth. So how has that been possible? It's a kind of a case study for him, that you have an experiment in pure bourgeois social relations in the northern North American colonies. So it's a kind of a laboratory for demonstrating his thesis on the wealth of nations. Now, at the same time that this kind of English colonial relationship is taking place, there is at the same time a parallel case, a contemporary case that can be compared, and that's the case of India. So the British conquest of India is happening around this time as well. It's very controversial. The government trading monopoly, the East India Company, almost accidentally conquers India, meaning it's drawing itself into domestic Indian politics and really the collapse of the Mughal Empire that ruled India through its trading relations, but then it's getting involved in the local politics, and it ends up conquering India, the East India Company, and this is actually controversial back in Britain. Meaning, is this what the East India Company was authorized to do? No. And so how should the metropolitan country, how should the United Kingdom or the English monarchy, it's kind of pre-UK, UK comes a little bit later, how should it relate to this having taken place, to the East India Company, its presence in India, ending up taking on a predominant political role because it's occurring at the same time that the Mughal Empire is collapsing in India. I mentioned that Adam Smith is a fierce critic of the East India Company. He gives a speech to Parliament about why the monopoly on trade should be broken and why India should not be ruled by the East India Company. Why India should be governed more according to the lines of the North American colonies, which have a great deal of self-government and have a great deal of freedom of trade. It's not a monopolized trading relationship. So the North American English colonies are free to trade with other European countries and also with other European colonies in the Western Hemisphere, in a way that the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch colonies are forced into a monopolistic trading relation, privileging, prioritizing, and even dominated by the metropolitan country, the home country. So Smith thinks that the reason that the English colonies have developed better than the other colonies is because of this freedom to trade that has allowed them to develop their domestic quote-unquote industry, their domestic production. And he sees the danger in India of domestic production in India being stifled by the British trade monopoly of the East India Company. Now, I should also say, because I mentioned slavery, this is the time when Smith is writing, this is the time of the beginning of abolitionism as a movement. So abolitionism begins in the 1700s. It begins when the slave population becomes self-reproducing, meaning where slaves are no longer being worked to death in plantations and constantly replenished in numbers by fresh recruits from Africa. But it's becoming a self-reproducing population. And it really is becoming more of a laboring population in the bourgeois sense, rather than simply a slave population of forced labor. One of the things that Smith does in discussing slavery is that he compares the legal status of slaves. So the legal status of slaves in the more traditional colonial contexts of the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the French, there's actually more rights for the slaves, if you will, because it's modeled on the medieval caste system and the rights of serfs. Whereas where that doesn't pertain, in the English case, because England is more bourgeois, actually the plight of the slave is worse. So where bourgeois social relations obtain more strongly, actually the condition of slavery is worse, ironically enough. But it also means that there's more of a impulse, there's more of a movement towards abolitionism. So abolitionism, is of course motivated by the horrendous conditions of slavery, where that more clearly contradicts the social relations. Whereas in the Portuguese, Spanish, and French case, there is a great deal of bourgeois social relations happening. These are modern monarchical systems, not traditional ones. They have been revolutionized already to a certain degree. They're absolute monarchies, so they've already been bourgeoisified, but not to the same extent formally as has taken place in England. So, therefore, there's more of a basis in the social relations, as well as in the legal relations and in the political relations, but in the social relations themselves, the social relations, the conditions, the practices, the ethos, the morality of labor. Slavery is more of a contradictory phenomenon. And therefore, there's more of a inspiration to abolish slavery. Not just to free some slaves, but to abolish slavery entirely. Abolitionism. So one of the things we talked about last night about the free city-states of Europe, the bourgeois towns and cities arising in the late medieval period in the Renaissance. Who's populating those cities? I sort of colorfully or provocatively said runaway slaves, meaning serfs who had no right to leave the land, actually fleeing the land and living in the city instead, laboring in the city rather than as serfs tied to the land. It's also the case that in this era of the Enlightenment in the 1700s, slavery has a kind of rhetorical value as a concept, meaning kind of everything is slavery. Everything is tyranny, everything is slavery. The old system is tyranny, it's slavery. The Anshan regime, it's tyranny, it's slavery. So everything is being done at some level under the auspices of abolishing slavery. So the old system is seen as a system of slavery, more broadly understood than just chattel slavery, than just strictly speaking what we associate with modern slavery. But the condition of serfs, the condition of workers in guilds. Workers in guilds are slaves of the guild. Serfs are slaves on the manorial estate. Everyone is subject to the arbitrary whims of the church and the aristocracy. So the commoners in general are slaves of the political and religious authorities, especially of the aristocracy, but also of the church. People are subjects of the monarchs. The monarchs have power of life and death over everyone. There are some religiously observed rights that people have, but not in the way that we think of rights in the bourgeois era, in the modern era. Human rights is not a thing. There are caste rights. There are rights and responsibilities owing to one's class position, but not human rights per se. Okay. Bourgeois right, especially grounded in labor, the rights of people in bourgeois society, the right to labor, life, liberty, and property, the John Locke set of inalienable rights articulated in the Glorious Revolution in England that establishes the constitutional monarchy in 1688. The system under which Smith is operating, and the system under which the colonies in North America have been greatly expanded. There is a basis there for a critique, an opposition, and an abolition of slavery. That's the critique of slavery that Adam Smith has. Adam Smith critiques slavery as unfree labor and as violating the rights of labor, but also violating the productive potential of labor. So society is being harmed by slavery. Not only the slaves themselves, but society as a whole is being held back by the institution of slavery. So this is the bourgeois critique of slavery. It's unproductive as labor. It's wasteful. It's a violation of innate rights of individuals, but it's also a violation of society. It's a violation of social potential, where that social potential is understood primarily in terms of wealth, in terms of productive activity. So, of course, the history of colonialism in the bourgeois era is inseparable from the history of slavery in the bourgeois era. The main form of colonization in this period, in Adam Smith's period, is in the Western Hemisphere. There is a late colonialism that comes later in the capitalist era after the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. And that's where you get the colonization of Africa. That doesn't take place at this time. There are some settlements, some trading outposts. There's Dutch settlement and Portuguese settlement in southern Africa. But there isn't a conquest. There isn't a colonial conquest of Africa actually until rather late, until the capitalist era, until the industrial era in the 1800s. Also, colonization in East Asia. So Indochina, Algeria, are acquired by the French in the 1800s, in the capitalist era, not in the 1700s. So there's late colonialism, there's capitalist colonialism, and that should be distinguished from bourgeois colonialism. Because then you have a reversion in capitalism to more of a Roman model. It's a mixture of things. It's a mixture of expansion of markets and expansion of production, but it's also a natural resource extraction and tributary relationship to the metropolitan country. But again, that happens under different conditions in the industrial era, where colonies are being acquired, yes, as markets, but more importantly as sources of natural resources for industry back home. That's different. All right, let me turn to the notes that you guys posted, and we can get into this, discussing this. All right, let's look at Indy. Here, I'll share my screen with you guys so we can look at the notes together.
A lot of what I wrote you did talk about a good bit, I will say.
Okay.
At least with, like, the mother city.
Uh-huh.
And the differences between, like, Greek and Roman colonization.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of made me think about, like, at what point did, like, colonization become immigration?
Mm-hmm.
And, like, at what, like, at, like, a personal level, where like, people fit into it?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right.
Also, this country felt very interesting as language.
What? Oh, waste country?
Yeah.
Right, meaning, land that's going to waste.
Yeah.
Or the wastes. Yeah, so what that means is not cultivated. Not, cultivated by settled agriculture.
Yeah.
Again, places where hunter-gatherer communities might live, but not where there's already established a civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there isn't like a clean distinction between those things, because the hunter-gatherers also farmed to a certain extent. They did. However, again, there is something to be observed in the change with the Neolithic revolution, with the agricultural revolution. So I think that people dispute these distinctions now because they see in everything a kind of apologetics for colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for Adam Smith, he's just looking at what happened. He's trying to be objective about it. He's trying to say, okay, where did people settle and how did the settlement take place? How was it affected by local conditions? So obviously, there's an established civilization. I think I mentioned that civilizations have much higher populations than hunter-gatherer communities. So the Aztecs and the Incas have much larger populations than the Native Americans of North America. Now, there was a civilization in North America that had collapsed in the period before European contact. And so it had reverted to a hunter-gatherer condition. So they would have encountered something different in the Mississippi. If European settlement had taken place or contact discovery had taken place 200 years earlier, they would have encountered something else. But again, in New England, for example, no, it's hunter-gatherers. It's definitely hunter-gatherers. And it's not that there's no population, but it's just a lower population than you'd get when you're dealing with the Incas and the Aztecs. Or earlier, like I said, if they had encountered the Mississippi.
Yeah.
So he's just describing what happened because, and again, we might not appreciate the fact that it was not easy for the Europeans to conquer people militarily because the Europeans didn't really have an overwhelming military might in this period. In the industrial capitalist era later, like when the Europeans conquer Africa, they're doing it with machine guns. That's just not the case in the 15 and 1600s. So it's not happening in the way that we might imagine. For instance, even the British, like the East India Company, the conquest of India, a lot of that is done with Indian troops that are, hired by the company in India. So it's much more of a political process than it is a brute force military process because the Europeans are just not that powerful. They're not capable of conquering that way. So how does it happen? Now, we know that the conquistadors, were very crafty, meaning how did they conquer the Aztecs and the Incas? Well, they made alliances with the people who were conquered and oppressed by the Aztecs and Incas. So they couldn't have conquered on their own. They had to have Native American allies. And so even the conquest is not what we might imagine. It was much more of a political process. It wasn't just a brute force military process. Because the Europeans weren't strong enough to do that. They were not capable of doing that. Now, what did happen was they established relations to the European home countries that, material relations that then really supported the colonial presence. But, in the Portuguese and Spanish cases, the settlement of Europeans in the Western Hemisphere is pretty light. Now, in the English case, there's more numbers of people moving to settle. So again, what you get is a more mixed population in the Spanish and Portuguese cases, and more of just settlers displacing indigenous people in the English case. You get a fusion, like in Mexico, you get a fusion of Spanish and Aztec civilizations. Like Mexican national identity is really understood as both Spanish and Aztec. In a way that, the United States is not doesn't conceive of itself. I mean, it conceives of itself to a certain degree, but not really doesn't conceive of itself as a fusion of Native American and English cultures in the way that Mexico does. Right, so that's part of what's going on here. And again, a lot of the settlement that does take place, especially in the English case, in the North American colonies. So people are affected very dramatically by European disease. It's a very drastic effect of exposure to European disease. So that creates an opportunity for greater settlement as well. And again, they're not looking to really subjugate the Native Americans. They just displace them.
Yeah.
Whereas the Spanish and the Portuguese are actually trying to subjugate the Native Americans. And again, just the context is different.
Mm-hmm.
So, he's just looking at it coldly, soberly, objectively, we might even say scientifically, and he's looking at it after it's happened. It's already happened. 1776, it's done. That process is largely complete, at least in the areas of the colonies. Meaning, of course, there are still Native Americans throughout North America. The French have a different arrangement, although I mentioned that in the 7 Years' War, the French territory is conquered by the English in North America. And that French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in North America, there are Native Americans fighting on both sides. And not just in a token way, but pretty much equally, there are people on the side of the English, Native Americans, and people on the side of the French. I should also say there's a great little anecdote that I love to tell about the Spanish conquest of the Philippines. So the Philippines were conquered by the Spanish, and they were fighting. They were conquering not only indigenous people in the Philippines, but they were also conquering Muslim kingdoms. And those Muslim kingdoms were themselves allies and supported by the Muslim world. And so there's this kind of Muslim versus Christian battle in Malacca around this time of the conquest of the Philippines, and the Spanish used Aztec warriors to defeat their rivals. And the Muslims write back, this is the period of, this is like early Ottoman Empire, or kind of pre-Ottoman Empire. The Muslim military advisors of the local Muslims, they write back and they're like, oh, the Spanish, they're just barbaric, they're just horrible, they've unleashed these Native American warriors on us. Right, so, yeah, I mean, it's a very complex, and of course the Aztec warriors who are helping the Spanish conquer the Philippines are happy, proud to do so, right? Because the Aztecs have a history of conquest. They have a history of being, kick-ass warrior civilization. And so they see themselves as participating in the Spanish Empire. So it's a very complex history, needless to say. It's a complex history that we tend to flatten in retrospect.
Yeah, that's insane.
Except it's not. It's very typical of the way the world was. Mm-hmm.
But just putting that all together, just like to use, okay, this little part of my colony, I'm going to bring him back specifically to go capture these people.
Yep.
It's just a really long, chain.
It is. It's because the world is being brought together, though. It's it's when the world's being circumnavigated, And so I think that I mentioned that the 7 Years' War, which happens later, but the 7 Years' War is already a world war. Like the war between the British and the French in the middle of the 18th century, in the mid-1700s, is taking place almost everywhere in the world simultaneously. It's happening in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, in Europe, in the Middle East, in India, in Asia, in Africa, in North and South America. It's happening everywhere. It's a world war. And of course, it's not just being prosecuted by the English and the French, but by all their allies, including their colonial subjects. Just as later on, at the end of this period of history, the end of colonization, in World War I, a huge number of troops fighting for the British are Indian, and a huge number of the troops fighting for the French are African. And this, of course, those troops go back home and they're like, we shouldn't be subjugated the way we are, and that helps spur independence movements. But the English and the French couldn't have fought the war in World War I without African and Indian troops. Not at all. As well as the British had their Australian and New Zealand troops and their Canadian troops. But they couldn't have prevailed. They couldn't have held out without Indian troops. So it's a complex history, and it tends to be, so to speak, whitewashed. It tends to be remembered in a very skewed way now. And we tend to project the later history back onto the earlier history, as if it was just one pattern uniformly. And in fact, major changes happened in colonial history, especially between the 1700s and the 1800s. A huge change takes place there in terms of the relationship between the metropole and the colonies. So Smith is not, a fan of colonialism. He's not. He sees the colonies naturally becoming independent. He sees the graduating from these tributary relations of conquest to relations of trade. He also assumes, he talks about this, he assumes that the Native Americans, insofar as they suffered setbacks from English colonialism, that the Native Americans will bounce back, that they'll recover, and that they will participate as more equal partners in trade with the English colonists. So he does not at all foresee what's going to happen, meaning a lot of the extreme violence and kind of exterminationism that we associate with colonialism is really something that happens later in the capitalist era. It's really something that happens in the late 1800s, in fact. It starts happening in the middle 1800s, but it really ramps up in the late 1800s. In terms of Native Americans, in terms of westward expansion and the fate of the Native Americans in the United States. This is not what Smith assumes will take place. Smith assumes that the Native Americans will exist on a more equal footing, and on an increasingly equal footing with the English colonists in North America. That's not what happens. Also, he assumes that slavery will be abolished. Now, it is eventually abolished, but slavery makes a comeback with the Industrial Revolution. It gives a new lease on life to slavery in a way that people in the 1700s didn't anticipate. So it has a second life in the industrial era that Adam Smith would not have foreseen. So he assumes a better future for the descendants of enslaved Africans and for Native Americans than turns out to be the case. in the 1800s. But that's really because of how capitalism develops. And so we have to be careful about how we understand this history. Because the material conditions change rather dramatically in the 1800s. But anyway, sorry, that was a tangent. Indy, let's go back to your notes.
Oh, I thought it was funny that Smith said, oh, I didn't quote the right part. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But it was something about how, like, that many colonies, like, forming their own governments and, like, own elected officials just wasn't, like, very possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he didn't see that as, like, a thing that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then it happened, like, not even, like, a whole 10 years later.
Uh-huh.
It's very interesting.
Well, he would rather the relationship between the colonies and England to have been reformed.
Yeah.
That's certainly true. However, there was also a great deal of local self-government in the English colonies, by contrast with the Spanish colonies and the French colonies. Now, he also advocates for that in India. He wants there to be more local self-government in India, as opposed to rule by the East India Company, and thereby by the British. So, the big complaint of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation.
Right.
So there is a question of expanding parliamentary representation to the colonists. That would have been another outcome. But in fact, that would have meant a democratic revolution in England itself. Because the parliamentary representation in England itself is very uneven. Meaning at that time, there's also what's known as the rotten boroughs. Meaning there are districts that are vastly unequal in terms of popular representation in England itself. So if you were to open up Parliament to representation of the colonists, you'd have to reform the way representation is happening in England itself. And that they're not prepared to do. Right. So there are radicals in England who are sympathetic to the colonial complaints and who are seeking reform in England itself. Smith is sympathetic to those people. Smith is, we could even say, one of those people. So, he does see a different potential path forward, but then he is sympathetic to the colonies in their revolt and their struggle for independence, in fact. Right? He blames the policies of the mother country for what happens, for it taking the course that it did. We could say in this respect, Smith is a liberal, for sure, but he's also a small r Republican, meaning he does want government to be responsible to the people. He does want a constitutional recognition of the power of the people. So democracy, certainly, but also, constitutional government. So now, in England's a monarchy. It's a constitutional monarchy, and in that way it is something like a republic. It does have democratic representation. But Smith would have wanted to see a great deal more in England itself. So that's really the rub of it, is that the only way the American colonies' complaints could have been adequately addressed have been through political reform in England itself.
Right.
Right. And he does oppose the specific policies that the American colonists are revolting against, meaning the restrictions placed on the colonies, in the new taxes, but the new limitations on trade and commerce, the attempt to assert a kind of trading monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, the northern colonies, the northern North American colonies, had developed according to a kind of benign neglect by the mother country for a great deal of this history, in the late 1600s and early 1700s. But in the context of the 7 Years' War, then suddenly the mother country takes a new kind of interest in asserting control. Whereas, in fact, we know that George Washington was an important English officer in the 7 Years' War. So the experience of the war actually is a spur towards American independence, certainly towards American self-governance. In the same way that I mentioned is also the case in India and Africa after World War I. Let me say something, just like looking at your notes, let me say something about, again, there's a kind of colonies that are like resource extraction and tribute.
Yeah.
And then there are colonies that basically are more centered on domestic production. And so we know that slavery is very much about producing raw materials and other kinds of goods for consumption back in the mother country,
Mm-hmm.
rather than for domestic consumption. And that's very important for Smith. Meaning, it's not really, even though it can take the form of a trading relationship, it's not a proper trading relationship. And so it's much more of a enforced relationship, and slavery is part of that. He even talks about how that there were Dutch people who tried to set up in the Spice Islands, which means in Southeast Asia, their own farms and plantations, and the Dutch, trying to control the trade, went and they sent military missions to wipe out, to burn the crops, but also wipe out the farmers who tried to set up farming outside the approved system. Right, so there's also in this period, I'll just make mention of this quickly because it comes up in Smith, but he doesn't really treat it in much detail. There's a great deal of what's known as piracy. And a lot of that has to do with independent trade and independent production that takes place in the Caribbean. What we would now call a kind of black market. And communities being set up outside the reach of the governing authority of the colonial powers. Right, so we know it as piracy, but actually there's more to it than that. That's also something very much the case in the 1700s. So people in the colonies are trying to assert their independent activity and to produce for trade and for their own consumption, as opposed to producing just for tribute to the mother country. Right, so he does think that a trading relationship between the colony and the mother country would be more beneficial to both in the long term. So he sees the more traditional, like, imperial colonialism as being dominated by the mercantile interest. In other words, it's much more about short-term profits. It's much more of a zero-sum game. That's the way people will talk about mercantilism. Like, when people use that term now, they'll say, oh, well, a mercantile view sees trade as a zero-sum game, as opposed to something that benefits both parties. So the mercantile view will be that one can only benefit at the expense of another. And they'll say, well, that's wrong. In fact, trade is mutually beneficial. And so it shouldn't be seen as a zero-sum game. So that's part of Smith's argument here, is that the colonial powers, mostly, including the British, act with a mercantile interest in which they assume that it's a zero-sum proposition and neglect how it's mutually beneficial. So he thinks the colonies should all be free to trade with each other and with different metropolitan countries, and that would ultimately be beneficial for everyone. But that policy is being driven by the mercantile interest, namely short-term profitability and immediate gain in a kind of zero-sum competition. And of course he thinks that's bad. Let me see.
So I unfortunately think I read the wrong section. So.
Acacia. Oh, what happened?
Well, I thought that tonight's reading was book 2 of Wealth of Nations, which is on stocks, but I realized we talked about that yesterday. I just didn't really...
so the volume 1, volume 2 thing got you confused.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
And I have no idea where the colonization section is. Like, where is that?
Oh, it's in volume 2.
Okay.
Okay, so it's in volume 2, and it's book 5. Let me look at...
Oh.
Yeah, hold on.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's... where did I... Here we go. No. This one. Okay, yeah.
I have it. Oh, okay.
Oh, book 4, sorry. Book 4.
Announcements. Okay, I was just...
Volume 2, book 4. And it's also confusing in the print book because the page numbers restart with volume 2.
Yeah, yes.
Right, so the page numbers listed on the syllabus can also be confusing.
Gotcha.
No, I'm very sorry about that.
No, I didn't look deeply enough into it.
Okay. Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and talk about the expenses of the sovereign and the education in particular. All right. See you in a few minutes. Okay, let's resume. All right, so let's turn to, I said there was another posting of notes. Maybe in a different thread, let's see. Okay, those are late notes from last night. Okay, so let me go back to Indy, to your notes on the next chapter. I'll share my screen with you guys.
Yeah, I thought the relation between as a society develops and then its need for a military and going from militia to military
Uh-huh.
just purely for it being a better like use of everybody's time and also being able to properly protect your city, especially if people who are like other societies or like governments that would want to conquer you,
Right.
like just coming in and invading. It's more beneficial to have an actual army.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also like as the colonization is happening, there isn't like that same level of military force or capability there for a lot of like the North American colonies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And even with like the Aztec and the Incan empires, there is a good deal of manpower. It's just a spear isn't a gun.
Right. 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 Yeah, the Europeans do have muskets. They have relatively inefficient firearms, so they don't have the kind of efficient firearms you see later in the industrial era. And also in the time that Smith himself is writing, there's some improvement. They're not mere muskets anymore. They're rifles. All right, so a couple of things. So again, bourgeois society tends to understand itself in terms of classical antiquity. So there's two histories coming to bear here for Smith. There's ancient history. There's history of ancient Greece, ancient Rome. There's also Renaissance history. There's the history of the free city-states of Europe. And one of the ways that those city-states established themselves in the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance era were the development of militias, meaning the only way they could defend themselves against the aristocrats, against the warrior caste of feudalism, was to develop more collective defense, and that was in the form of militia. And meaning citizen soldiers, so to speak, which is what we now refer to in terms of the National Guard, which is what's left of the militia in the United States. So citizen soldiers. And he's saying that, on the one hand, that's politically desirable. On the other hand, it's becoming more practically infeasible as technology develops. But let's look at the political side of it. So he does think that there still is a place for the militia, and there's still a place for popular military education. So the idea that for a country to retain its independence, to defend itself, and for the citizens to retain social power and political power, that they should, like the right to bear arms in the United States is based on this kind of idea of an armed citizenry as opposed to just the state, the standing army of the state. So it's part of democracy, we could say. But again, there is this technological aspect of things, meaning there is a place for the central government to raise funds and arm a standing army as opposed to just relying on a popular militia that is based on local volunteers, local funding, etc. So there's kind of a tension here between a more Renaissance humanist ideal and also a classic citizen ideal going back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. There's a tension there in terms of the modern world. It's also, when we get into like education proper We talked a little bit about this yesterday, about like mental and physical education, but also martial education. So the idea of a well-rounded person, the well-rounded educated person, who is, and also education specifically as compensating for the specialization in the division of labor. Right, so you would need physical and military and other kinds of intellectual education to make up for the deficits of over-specialization in the division of labor. And the military piece is a part of that. But this section, the broad section that we're reading from, is essentially on the role of government. And so the role of the government, the role of public expense. So the revenue and expense of the sovereign, which means the government. It means the public authority. In what way is it necessary? What is its role? And of course the military is one aspect of it. Right, so with a citizen's militia, people own their own arms, and they're responsible for that, for arming themselves. And with a standing army, of course, that's not the case. That's much more of a government responsibility to arm and fund the arming of that army. Now, you talk about the infrastructure as well.
A little bit.
A little bit.
Like, the government creating jobs for people by, like, maintaining things for us. Like, bridges, roads, all of that, which feels like what the government should be doing. And then with, like, education and how the government should be, like, helping people, and the current dismantlement of that.
Or at least they want to.
They want to.
At least they want to. So let's talk about that a bit. So the Europeans, going back to this time, it is a different system than we have in the United States, in large measure, especially when Smith is writing. So, and in the transition to independence, there's also a change. So in the European system, the universities are medieval institutions, they're church institutions. They're primarily for the education of the clergy, but also of the aristocracy. And it's part of how the religious authorities, it's part of how the church indoctrinates the aristocracy. So they are public institutions. They're state institutions. The fact that they're church institutions means that they're state institutions, because in Europe, the church and the state are unified. So the monarch in England is the head of the Church of England. Right, this is the breakaway that Henry VIII effected from Roman Catholicism. So that means that in England, the church went from being run by the Catholic Church to being run by the Anglican Church to being run by the monarch. And so in the reforms that came out of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, the universities become much more public institutions, simply, rather than monarchical and church institutions. So there's very little private education, higher education, by comparison. Now, the other thing that you guys need to understand is that in the 1700s, there's no grade school. There's no K through 12 education. That simply doesn't exist. So children are educated at home. To a certain extent, they're educated by the church, but really they're educated at home. So only higher education exists. There's child labor. There's child education, and that would be in the form of like the guild, the artisan guilds. They would pay parents to basically take children as their wards, and then they'd be educated in work. But there isn't what we now know of as like primary education. That's not a thing. That actually doesn't really happen until the late 1800s and even into the 20th century. Happens in the industrial era. So that's not a thing. So there's only higher education. And higher education is mostly public. So here in the United States, a great preponderance of higher education is private. In Europe, it's all public. There are very few private higher education institutions. And that goes back deep into this history, the origins of that. Now, he does talk about private education and how basically the university system comes out of the medieval church and aristocratic and monarchical institutions. But that there is, in the bourgeois era, bourgeois education. So there are new schools that are started up that are private schools that are created out of need. In other words, there's a need to educate that bourgeois society brings with it, that the old medieval institutions are not able to adequately meet because they're really still stuck in the past. They're primarily theological institutions. They're not scientific institutions. Not yet. That changes in the 1800s. But when Smith is writing, if you want a modern scientific bourgeois education, you have to go to the private school as opposed to the public school. And he actually uses women's education as an example. The women's education institutions are, in a sense, the best because they're the most practically oriented. They're the most geared towards the actual needs of society. And again, these are private institutions. Now, he makes an argument for what we would call a kind of market-driven educational system. He thinks that students should pay professors directly, and professors should only earn an income insofar as their knowledge and education is considered useful by students. Now, why does he argue that? Well, we would now think of as like a kind of marketized, privatized educational system, because what he has in his own time is really a corrupt system in which a lot of professors don't have any students, and yet they're getting a very high salary because they're getting their institutional position as a function of patronage. So they're sinecures. They're no-show jobs, we might say, and through political favoritism. And it's through the aristocratic political system that this is happening, that people have academic positions in the old universities. Not entirely, but to a large extent, to much too great of an extent. So there is what we would call a corruption of the educational system that he sees as tied to the old role of universities as public institutions. Because again, the church and the aristocracy are very much connected, and there's a great deal of corruption and favoritism and cronyism. There's political favoritism, there's institutional corruption, There's just much too much of that. And so Smith is, really railing against the education system as completely unfit for the task of modern bourgeois society, the actual educational needs of society. So he's calling for reform there. So he's saying, okay, there is this public expense, education, but it's actually not justified because it's not actually serving the public. People are learning useless theology and metaphysics. It's a playground for aristocratic men. All right, so he talks about it as a kind of like finishing school for aristocratic and politically connected people. So he says, okay, there's also like studying abroad. There's also going abroad for education. He says that's not much better. It's a little better, but it's not much better. But at least it gives people exposure to the greater world and gives them some experience that might be worth something educationally. But really, he sees education as not fit for the task. And so that's why he's arguing for what we would now see as a kind of privatized, market-driven system. And we have to think about, where that advocacy is coming from, because he would see it as a legitimate public expense if the education were actually geared towards the needs of society, if it actually did serve the practical purpose that's required. And again, his notion of education, he thinks that there should be more of a scientifically based education, and it should be based on more of a humanistic ideal, and reach back to the ideals of education from classical antiquity. Physical, intellectual, martial, military education, in order to create a more balanced, well-rounded citizenry, public. But that education is actually not serving that role at this point. Now, he does have some discussion as well here, because it's related to education, to infrastructure, and also to military matters. What's the role of the old aristocracy, especially insofar as they are landlords? That they've been bourgeoisified, that their role has been converted in the money economy. What's their social role? What's their political role? Because they do have a political role. And he sees it as potentially beneficial. It's beneficial insofar as it's a kind of conservative force that's a check on, that's a counterbalance to what would otherwise be the case, which is what he calls the shopkeeper's interest, or what we were talking about earlier as the mercantile interest. That everyone in society is potentially subject to the imperatives of buying cheap and selling dear, and therefore setting policies that are for short-term gain and short-term advantage, short-term profit, at the expense of actually realizing the potential of society, actually developing society in a more thoroughgoing way. So the public can't really be necessarily relied upon to make good decisions. They might pursue short-term interests at the expense of their longer-term interests. And because of that, he's living in and speaking to a parliamentary representative system of government. There actually is a place for the House of Lords as a more conservative counterweight to the House of Commons. Which again, the House of Commons might make decisions on the basis of who it's representing, the more general public, the bourgeois public, where policies might be driven by short-term considerations at the expense of longer-term considerations. So he even sees a role, but a very specific role, politically for the aristocracy as a landlord class in particular, as a kind of counterbalance to the untrammeled commercial profit seeking of the mercantile interest in society, or what he calls the interest of shopkeepers, which, by the way, that's actually a term for referring to England. It's a nation of shopkeepers. So he sees a political danger there in that a representative parliamentary political system expressing the popular interest might actually be at the expense of the true public interest. So here, Rousseau's notion of the general will. The sovereign as representing the general will, which is not the majority will, nor is it the aggregate will of the people, but a will and an interest that transcends the majority interest or the aggregate interest. Right, so there are the interested parties in the social contract, in any kind of social relation, in any kind of social interaction. There's the self-interest of the participants, but then that their interaction actually has a result that is greater than the self-interest of the parties to it. So the idea of the general will as greater than the sum of its parts. And of course, the sovereign, the public authority, the government, is really charged with protecting that interest of the general will and not just expressing the majority will. That's a very tricky proposition. And we'll see that as Kant and Constant will be discussing in the reading for Thursday, it really is a matter of public debate, the public sphere, but also civil liberties, civil society, the civil sphere outside the political sphere. So a public sphere that isn't immediately about the government and the state. That these things have to be hashed out. And they're constantly being adjudicated and re-adjudicated. And again, you need a informed public, but also an educated public. You need a public that can actually make considered judgment and good use of information. So this is a period of mass literacy, newspapers, pamphlets, a lot of public discourse, a lot of public debate. And that's necessary. And really, there should be education geared towards making the citizens capable of participating in that kind of public sphere. But again, it's a tricky proposition, how to represent the general will of society when that's not equivalent to a majority or even a kind of consensus aggregate view. That there might be a will, an interest in society that its members are not aware of, that are not fully conscious of, but might need to become enlightened about. So that's one of the things that we'll be talking about in the What is Enlightenment essay by Kant that we'll discuss on Thursday. So again, there's a new need for education. What is the need of education? Coming down from the medieval system, the universities are really about indoctrinating and politically controlling the aristocracy by the church. But that's not what bourgeois society needs. Bourgeois society needs a lot more practical education. And it really needs to educate people to be able to learn. It needs to educate their reasoning capacities, their ability to make use of information, and to make the ability to make considered judgments about things. and to think about the greater interest, rather the general interest as opposed to the particular interests. The general will as opposed to the particular wills of people in society. And he doesn't think the education system that exists in his time really serves that purpose. So, how is the public being educated? Outside the formal educational system. It's being educated in the civil, social, public sphere, in civil society. Through journalism, through popular literature, through newspapers, through pamphlets. Not so much through the public formal educational system. Right, so we could say that there's a constant tension there between education as a public institution controlled by the governing authorities and the actual needs of education in society. Maybe there's a constant threat of the corruption of the education system if it's just to serve the established powers that be, the status quo. Especially as society changes, as culture changes, as new needs arise, new kinds of educational needs arise. All right, other thoughts that you guys had on the readings for tonight in our last few minutes of class today? I'm sorry if there was any confusion about the reading. It can be a little confusing because it's divided into 2 volumes, like that.
I will definitely just be using the announcements from now on.
Yeah, I mean, you guys should get emails from the announcements too.
Yeah, I think I probably did.
Okay.
I just thought I found it on my own.
Uh-huh. No, I'm very sorry about that.
No,
let me see, someone just posted to the chat. Oh yeah, so I haven't taken volunteers yet. Maybe we could take volunteers if we have a few minutes now. So let me go back to the syllabus. All right, so the Monday reading is from Hegel. So it's the introduction to the philosophy of history. Let me ask you guys if there are volunteers for Monday for Hegel. Hegel is notoriously difficult, but actually this reading is not difficult because it's lectures. The introduction to the philosophy of history, these are lectures, and so they're actually a lot more straightforward and comprehensible than Hegel's notorious for.
I'll volunteer to make up for this.
Oh, okay. You don't have to necessarily make up, but cool. All right, Acacia, that's good. That's one. Do I have a second volunteer for Monday?
I can do it.
Okay, Jacqueline. Good,
Yeah.
thank you. So, Cato, you want to do Tuesday?
Yes, please.
Okay. So Tuesday will be primarily the 1844 manuscripts, but also a couple of other short readings by Marx. Could I get a second volunteer for Tuesday for the first section of Marx next week? Anybody for Tuesday?
I can do it.
Grace? Great.
Yes.
Grace and Cato for Tuesday. Now, Thursday, the main reading will be the Communist Manifesto, but we'll also have some other short readings on Marx's political view in circa 1848 for Thursday. So anyone for Thursday? Communist Manifesto, children. It's awesome.
I can go for Thursday.
Okay. Indy, that's one. Anyone else for Thursday?
If I'm going to this Thursday, can I go again when we read the Colonies manifesto next Thursday, or is it like?
Yes, you can. But then probably you will have fulfilled then, at
Okay.
least to begin with, your volunteering requirements. So yes.
Okay, then maybe down the line. I just feel bad because no one. I mean, if no one else wants to do it, I'll do it.
Yeah, nobody's
That's
stepping
cool.
up.
Okay, I'll do next Thursday too.
All right, Indy and Haley for the manifesto. Okay, great, thanks. So we got volunteers for next week. I'll put up the discussion threads for that after the Thursday class this week. All right, so let's adjourn for now, and I will look forward to seeing you guys on Thursday to discuss content constant. All right, good night, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Wait, I have one question before we go.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
For the like, it's not like a formal presentation, right? We kind of just go through our notes and like
Yes.
go back and forth with you about it. Okay.
Yes.
Sounds good. Just
Cool.
making sure.
Yep.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye.